Welcome back to the Bible in Context,
where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation. How you doing, Caleb?
Recovering. This probably sounded a little bit different today. My family's all under the weather, and so we are recording remotely right now.
I appreciate you not wanting to get me sick.
Anyway, just annoying, but, we can still dive into the Canon.
Yeah, so we're back in the Canon, and today we're going to do a little bit of recapping of the significance of the Masoretic Text and talk about the Septuagint, also do some comparisons. And we had talked about earlier wanting to dive into some specific passages just to take a look at the differences and to show why the Bible that we have in our hands today is reliable and trustworthy. And it's okay to look at our English text and believe what we have in front of us is helpful and useful.
Yeah, something Christians need to be familiar with, especially with all the new texts we've discovered in the last 100 years, and everybody's saying, like, now these need to be part of our Bible, and, well, maybe not.
Right.
So let's just dig in here again just to recap that in the past few episodes, go listen to those if you haven't, we talked about how in the, up to 200 years before the time of Jesus, the Masoretic Text was pretty much the primary Hebrew Bible of the Jews, of the Second Temple era Jews. However, there's also the Septuagint, which, among other different textual traditions, the Masoretic Text and the Septuagint both kind of rise to the top as having more or less equal antiquity behind them. Because we have the Septuagint, which began translation between the 3rd and 2nd century BCE, and the Masoretic Text, the earliest copies we have of that, come from around 200-ish BCE, so that comes from a tradition that's even older than 200, but even still, these are very old textual traditions with slight variations, and so we have to ask the questions, do we care about the variations that much, and if we do, which one's correct?
Right. Well, and you've mentioned to me that in the New Testament, as the apostles are writing the New Testament, they tend to quote from both.
Yeah, sometimes, Paul especially, he'll do just his own ad hoc translations of the Masoretic Text. Other times he's quoting directly from the Septuagint, and other times it's not exactly aligning with either. Maybe he tweaks the verbiage to make a point or something like that. Again, check out Gallagher's translation of the 70 for some details on that. But yeah, the apostles, they were comfortable with both, and I think there might be a reason for that we've already kind of discussed, and that is that if the point of the Old Testament is relaying that tradition from Torah, then if there are variations between different textual traditions, but both of those variations are in line with the tradition of Torah, the apostles probably didn't care which version's correct. If there's slight variations that are still in line with that tradition, that's probably why we see such comfort between the Septuagint and the Masoretic Text among the apostles.
Right. Well, and it seems like those, like the scribes and those who were involved in both of those pieces of literature, were trying their best to articulate the original author's intent in their language.
Right. Yeah. Even whenever you see in the Septuagint, at times you will see it intentionally vary from the Masoretic Text. Whenever it's possible that the Masoretic Text was behind that translation, you'll see them intentionally vary from the text to facilitate understanding, just like the Targums do. They'll change words to fit their current context so that the current readers can understand what the original text meant. So, and we do that too in our Bibles. That's the difference between an NASB or ESV and like a CSB or something like that. Something that's more thought for thought rather than word for word.
Right. And so we see the same thing in older translations, that they were doing their best to try to help people of their day understand the original author's intent.
Right, and we've already talked about, too, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, you see a lot of that. So that's not something new. Again, same thing we do today with our Bibles.
Right.
So, do you want to dive into some differences?
Yeah. So what are the differences between the Masoretic Text and the Septuagint?
Yeah, so sometimes it is just, straight up mistranslation. So the Septuagint was translated, we've already talked about this a bit some in our previous couple episodes. Sometimes the Septuagint was translated from a Masoretic type text. Other times it seems like it's coming from something a little bit different. There may be a different textual tradition in the Hebrew that the Septuagint was translating from. And so sometimes it's just straight up mistranslation. The translator into Greek didn't fully understand what he was doing. Actually, Emmanuel Taub has an entire paper on that for the Book of the 12, on places where it seems like that translator was using a Masoretic text type, but was making mistakes because they didn't fully understand all the words they were translating from the Hebrew. Sometimes we just talked about there's facilitating translations, interpretive translations that are not trying to be word for word, so small variations because of that. And sometimes it's just because that underlying Hebrew textual tradition was a little bit different. So that's the reason we see some variations between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text. But the questions we want to ask is, with these variations all accounted for, do we have a wildly different Bible between these two traditions? And some, I think, will overplay the variations that we see, and some will underplay them. There are differences. Sometimes there are differences in meanings in certain passages, but overall, it's really the same texts, and the meaning as the later texts try to draw out the tradition of Torah are not all that different. It's relaying the same core truths and same core tradition. And again, I think that's why there was probably such comfort with these two textual types in the ancient or in the Jewish mindset. So we'll dive into a few examples here just to kind of show what some of these differences look like in the text, and just take a look at how actually different the meaning of the text is based on these variations.
Right. And so, like you said, we're going to highlight some of the differences, but the vast majority of the Septuagint is very close to what we have in the Masoretic text, right? I mean, we're not looking at like every other verse. I mean,
right.
It's probably similar to like comparing an NASB to an ESV or an NIV.
In a lot of respects, yeah. And there are some places where it's like, okay, that sentence is different, but it doesn't affect the overall meaning of the passage or the book. And sometimes it's easy to tell, like, hey, that's not right. Like the translator messed up here. But overall, even in larger changes where, we have Jeremiah and Ezekiel are shorter in the Septuagint than in the Masoretic text, if you go read the Septuagint, the meaning of the book overall is not going to be wildly different than that of the Masoretic text. Masoretic text at times will draw out a little bit more on God's promises than the Septuagint in those particular places where there are missing passages in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but still the message and the promises that God has made as well are not overall different. So it's really not a big difference if you read one over the other.
Right. Well, and part of this too is we're reading English translations of these, and so there's going to be some interpretive decisions that were probably made from Greek to English or Hebrew to English.
Right. Well, okay, so just to put this in perspective, before we dive into our first example here, let me just talk about Jeremiah 10, because I think that'll kind of help. I'm not going to read through it because it's a long section, but it's in Jeremiah 10, and basically Jeremiah is railing against the idolatry that he is confronting. And the Masoretic text in verses 6 through 10 adds this statement of the Lord's kingship amidst the denouncement of these idols. And really expounds on God's kingship, where the Septuagint doesn't have that. And something that you could see as you're reading through the Masoretic text is it's really just whoever added that section, assuming that it's not original. It may be the original reading, but if it were added, all it's doing is bringing out what is already implicit in the Septuagint text. Because the Septuagint is saying the idols are nothing, and so the Masoretic text is just drawing out, whoever edited that section is just drawing out that by comparison, Yahweh is everything. So overall, Orthodox meaning, not changed. Just a nice little homily in the middle there. So you want to dive into, first of all, just a classic example of the changes between the Septuagint and Masoretic text is Amos 9, 11, and 12, because that passage is actually quoted by James in the book of Acts. And so let's go ahead and read that verse.
All right.
Tell you what, you read, read 11 through 12, and I will, in the ESV, I assume it's probably what you have, and I'll read it in the Lexham English Septuagint.
Okay. So Amos 9, starting in verse 11, In that day I will rise up the booth of David that is fallen and repair its breaches and raise up its ruins and rebuild it as in the day of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations who are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this.
Okay. So now I'm going to read the Lexham English Septuagint, and again, there are some English choices that have to be made here when you're translating. So you'll hear a lot of synonymous language, but the real difference is in the first statement of verse 12. So I'll go ahead and start reading in verse 11, and it says, "On that day I will raise up the tent of David that has fallen." Sounds pretty much the same. "And I will rebuild its things that have fallen, and I will raise up its things that have been destroyed, and I will rebuild it just as the days of eternity, so that the remnant of the people, rather than the remnant of Edom, and all the nations upon whom my name was invoked upon them, will search for me, says the Lord who is making these things." Okay, so the big difference here is in the Masoretic Text, which is what this passage in the ESV is translated from. It says that they will possess the remnant of Edom, whereas the Septuagint says that the remnant of the people will come to Yahweh. And so one has the domination of Edom, one has the coming of the peoples. Now, why the difference? Well, first of all, the word possess is left out of the Septuagint, that kind of conquering language. And then the difference between Edom and the people is really probably a confusion on the part, or an intentional change within the Hebrew text. So in Hebrew, Edom is Edom, and people are Adom. And if you know your Hebrew at all, you'll know there's no vowel pointings in the original text. And so it was just the same consonants for Edom and peoples.
So in the original text, it would have looked the same.
Right.
And so you have to make an interpretive decision on what the meaning is.
Right. The context does clearly show that Edom is the one that is meant, but you could see how someone got there and was confused. Alternatively, it could be that this translator saw that there's already a very prominent theme of the peoples coming to God in the minor prophets, and so this translator may have just decided to keep with that theme and change this for the sake of the understanding or the highlighting of that theme for the audience. So either way, you're not outside of the realm of biblical theology. On one hand, God is going to deliver his people and conquer his enemies. On the other hand, he's going to bring the nations to himself.
Right. So the overall story doesn't change based on which one you're looking at.
Right. And that may be exactly why James felt comfortable, grabbing from the Septuagint.
Right.
If assuming he knew that it wasn't the original.
Right. Well, and I wonder when James is saying that, what's he trying to convey? Like, what's his point that he's trying to convey? I wonder if they're
talking about the influx of the Gentiles into the believing Jewish community at the time. And so, he's showing like here, the prophets are already talking about like God wants to bring the nations in. And so he grabbed this verse. Yeah.
It makes sense to quote from the Septuagint because it emphasizes that aspect of what God is doing in redemptive history.
Right. And you can look at James and say, well, that's not actually what it says. But that meaning is already in the heart of the minor prophets, along with, the rest of the Torah, as far back as Genesis, we've talked about on the podcast, with Abraham under his trees with his Amorite friends, things like that. So for James to grab this, it's no big deal. And they may not have known which one was original, but both versions are in keeping with the traditions of Torah. So
right.
Ultimately, he may not have cared.
Critics, though, are going to look at that passage in James and say, look, James is misquoting the Old Testament. You can't trust him. Right.
But we need to shift our paradigm a little bit about, again, keeping in step with the traditions handed down from Torah.
Yeah. No, I think that those who were writing the Septuagint, like we said before, their heart is to keep in step with the Torah, to keep in step with the original author's intent.
Well, and I think something that you're getting at is the fact that, the critic's going to say we can't trust any of this because of that mistake right there. And it's like, well, hang on.
Seeming mistake. Yeah.
Right. And so because of that one, we'll say inconsistency, you can call it that. Okay, fine. If you find one inconsistency, does that mean you've disproved everything? No, it doesn't. Not in the slightest. You need to disprove everything, or at least a significant portion, to say that, hey, this is no longer reliable. Just like if I don't know, me and Nate, if me and you witness, I don't know, a car crash from different perspectives, and we give the report, and 95% of our reports are the exact same with a little 5% discrepancy, are the police going to say, these are both crap now? We can't take either of these reports. Or they're going to say, okay, let's question that, but everything else, that tracks.
Right, right.
So don't get hung up on those little things. And if you're a critic, you can't really make that case. So,
All right, do you want to look at another one?
yeah, let's do it. What do you got?
You want to do Deuteronomy 32?
Let's do that one. That one's become pretty famous as of late.
Yes.
Okay, so in Deuteronomy 32:8, where it's talking about God apportioning the nations, it says that he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. Now, what does the Septuagint have?
They have according to the number of the angels of God.
Yeah. And so, again, if anyone here knows Mike Heiser or listened to our episode on the Tower of Babel where we talked about divine counsel a little bit, you'll know that the sons of God are thought of in the ancient Near East and in the Bible as most often as spiritual beings that God has created, and often ones that help him to rule the world that he created to be on his divine counsel for ruling the world. And so the Masoretic Text here has changed the word God, which is El, to Israel. So you can hear the difference there already, from El to Israel, because I guess one of the ancient copyists was uncomfortable with saying that the borders were fixed according to the number of the sons of God and changed it to the numbers of the sons of Israel. However, the Septuagint changed the wording a little bit by saying angels of God, but kept the meaning behind that.
Yeah, and so what they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls then helped the ESV change what traditionally had been Israel to sons of God. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, we've talked about how we have, for instance, like the Leningrad Codex, like it's a codex from about 1,000 years ago. One of the main sources of Masoretic tradition that we use to translate our Bibles. We found this passage from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is, well over 1,000 years older than our Masoretic text that we typically use to translate. And it had a change here that said the sons of God rather than the sons of Israel. And so with that, we realized that the also old tradition of the Septuagint was more correct than the Masoretic tradition, and realized that, okay, angels of God, sons of God, given the meaning of those in their original cultural context, the sons of God is the correct Hebrew reading. So let's go to Psalm 8:3. This one's a little more simple.
I was going to say the Deuteronomy one
That one
is a
does.
pretty big deal.
Well, you can see there that the overall meaning within biblical theology, if you take that one verse out, does it destroy the divine counsel worldview and what spiritual beings are in the Bible?
No, but it is it's super helpful to recognize what the that's not even a necessarily a problem with the Septuagint or even the Masoretic text, as much as I guess the Masoretic text over time.
Well, yeah, the issue was the corruption of the text there by the scribe that miscopied that piece,
Right.
that one word.
Right.
And yes, you're right that that particular passage is affected by that change, but again, overall biblical theology is not. And so sometimes
you can make a very strong argument for the divine counsel outside of Deuteronomy 32.
Right. I mean, from Paul alone, you can, much less, Psalm 89 and other places. And then also just comparing the creation account to the ancient Near Eastern backgrounds, things like that. So, point being that, yes, even if you do come across a change that does affect the significance of a certain passage, first of all, the divine counsel is kind of peripheral in this whole passage. This is Moses' whole song, and this is one little line out of it. And so we're not affecting the overall significance of the passage, but we do change the meaning of that little section. But again, we haven't completely destroyed some theological strand in the Bible, or even come across something that's really, heretical or against biblical theology.
Right. All right. So you want to move on to Psalm 8?
Yeah. So in Psalm 8, verse 2 in your English Bibles, and 8 verse 3 in your Septuagint, in the LXX English Septuagint, there is a single word change in the psalm, and this is one that Jesus quotes, and so that's why this one's become, again, more of a hot button issue. And so again, reading out of the ESV to represent the Masoretic text, it says, "Out of the mouths of babies and infants you have established strength." So what does the Septuagint of chapter 8, verse 3 say there in that beginning phrase?
So out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies you created praise.
Between the Masoretic text and the Septuagint, you have babies, God establishing out of the mouths of babies strength or establishing praise. Not a huge difference. Neither one really contradicts any sort of theology. It's actually both pretty well in line with biblical truth. And so a word difference, but it doesn't really affect much of anything. And I know you can make a case of like, well, yeah, in this particular case, this one word, like it's changed. And so there is a different point being made, blah, 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 blah. But ultimately, I mean, okay, babies are ascribing strength to God. Babies are praising God. They're kind of both along the same lines. And so I wouldn't make a huge deal out of it and say, again, the Bible's untrustworthy or that it's wrong to read the Septuagint here. Again, both I think are in accord with the tradition of Torah. So just another example is, without going to read this one, this is in Nehemiah 11. There's a list of inhabitants that are in the city with Nehemiah, and the Septuagint list is much shorter. And again, there's a shorter list in this census here, but again, really the overall meaning of the passage is not affected by a shorter list of people. So, relatively large textual difference, not really a difference in the carrying forward of the tradition of Torah, the hopes, promises, typology made there. And that's why, so this is something we're going to talk about actually next week, that I just want to mention it now. We're going to talk about the level of inspiration. I think that needs to be discussed here. What is inspired? Is the stroke of the pen inspired? The letter? Is the word inspired? Is the overall paragraph inspired? When we say the Bible is inspired, what do we mean by that? How detailed and specific is that? How much can you change and it not be the Bible anymore? So we're going to ask questions like that. I think that has to be answered even in this discussion here about the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, especially since the apostles are comfortable with both. Okay, so one more just for fun, because this verse is near and dear to our hearts on this podcast, and that is Genesis 4:7. Mm-hmm. Now, in this one, I haven't looked up to see if there was possibly a Masoretic Hebrew underlying the Greek here. I know typically for the Torah, it's assumed that there was a different Hebrew tradition underlying the Greek translation. But we don't know here if there was, again, a different Hebrew here or if the Septuagint author didn't know what he was reading and just punted. But you'll see what I mean. First, let's read the ESV as kind of a representation of a typical translation of the Masoretic text. I will tell you what I think it should be retranslated as. Again, you can look it through the waters or go listen to the episode on Genesis 4 to hear the details on that, and then we'll read the Septuagint, and you'll definitely see there are some differences.
All right, so the ESV reads, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it."
Yeah, and so here's how it should be translated. Again, go listen to those other resources if you want the details on this. But if you do well, will there not be lifting up? And if you do not do well, a sin offering is lying at the entrance, presumably of Cain's tent. Its submission is to you, but you must rule over it. Okay, now the Septuagint. Again, this is from the LXX English Septuagint, and it says, "Have you not sinned if you offer rightly but do not divide rightly? Calm down. His recourse will be to you, and you will rule him." Now, you definitely hear some differences in there. I think that's a little more aligned with the translation that I have proposed, and the fact that the recourse of whatever God is talking about will be to Cain, rather than the desire being contrary to Cain. But there are definitely some differences here, because he's having more discussion about the offering and dividing the offering rightly, which we don't really see in the Masoretic text.
Right.
So again, I don't know if there was a difference in the underlying Hebrew, if the author just didn't know what to make of this exactly, so he was like, maybe this is kind of what it means, I'm going to write this down to maybe explain it, and try to facilitate the understanding here. We don't know, but there's a clear difference here. And this, I think overall, this verse, it is important. We've talked about this one pretty in depth, but even with that, if this verse, you just read both of these and you're like, I have no idea what to do with this, that's fine. You're not going to miss the overall biblical truths. And, I think that a lot of our modern translations miss this verse anyway, and I don't think that anyone is misunderstanding the hopes, promises of Yahweh, who humans are in light of him, who Jesus is, because they misunderstood this verse. So, as we've been running through this, what have we learned from these smattering of examples that we've looked at?
Yeah, I would say that the differences are pretty insignificant as far as the meaning of the text goes.
Right. And so, again, I think that brings us back to the question of if the meaning is the same, but the words at times are different, sometimes even passages are different, there's stuff left out. What is inspired when we come to the biblical text? We'll talk about that next time, because I think we need to address it, because how can both be different in places and the apostles be comfortable with both? We got to talk about that question. So, next week we will come back and talk about the level of inspiration, now that we've seen some of the differences between two texts that were held as highly respected by the apostles in early Jewish community.
All right, sounds good.